Imagine walking up to a 15-year-old SUV. The odometer flashes 420,000 kilometers. And yet, when you open the door, sit down, and start driving, it feels shockingly close to new. Most people would run away from numbers like that. They hear luxury SUV and over 400,000 kilometers in the same sentence and think, no thanks, I don't want a money pit. But this 2009 Lexus RX is different. Today we're going to look at why this high mileage Lexus still feels tight, quiet, and surprisingly fresh. And what that means for you if you're thinking about buying an older RX and keeping it for years. First impressions of a 420,000 kilometer Lexus. At first glance, there's nothing crazy about this 2009 Lexus RX. It looks like any other clean, well-kept used SUV. The paint still has a nice shine. The headlights are a bit cloudy, but not too bad. The body lines are straight. The doors close with a solid thunk, and there's no obvious rust eating away at the bottom. If you didn't look at the odometer, you might guess it has 180,000, maybe 220,000 kilometers. But then you turn the key or press the start button, and you see that number, 420,000 kilometers. In most cars, that would mean rattling plastics, a transmission that shifts like it's half asleep, and an engine that sounds tired and rough. Yet when you pull away in this RX, the steering still feels calm and predictable, the suspension still absorbs bumps smoothly, and the cabin is still impressively quiet for its age. So, how did this happen? How does a 15-year-old Lexus RX get to this kind of mileage and still feel this composed? To understand that, we need to look at three things: how it was built, how it was treated, and what really matters when you're buying one. What makes the 2009 Lexus RX special? The 2009 Lexus RX sits in a sweet spot in car history. It's modern enough to have comfortable suspension, good safety features, a quiet cabin, and the kind of luxury that still feels nice in 2025. But it's also old school enough that it doesn't rely on overcomplicated electronics, 15 different turbochargers, or a fragile dual clutch gearbox. Under the hood, you typically find a 3.5-liter V6 engine, a naturally aspirated, proven design that Lexus used for years. No turbo, no supercharger, no crazy high pressure fuel systems, just a solid V6 that, when maintained properly, can do hundreds of thousands of kilometers. The transmission is a conventional automatic, not some experimental new tech that was rushed to market. It shifts smoothly, it's not overstressed, and if the fluid is changed regularly, it can keep working long after most people expect it to fail. The RX was never meant to be a hardcore off-roader or a track weapon. It was built to do something different: be comfortable, quiet, and absolutely predictable for families and professionals who just needed a car that would start every morning with zero drama. And that goal, reliability, smoothness, and simplicity, is exactly why a 15-year-old example with 420,000 kilometers can still feel way better than you'd expect. But good engineering alone isn't enough. What really separates this Lexus from many other cars at this mileage is how it was treated. The owner's story: how do you reach 420,000 kilometers? Cars don't reach 420,000 kilometers by accident. Behind almost every high mileage Lexus RX, there's the same kind of owner story. Someone who needed a dependable, comfortable vehicle for commuting, business trips, or long family drives. Someone who didn't see their car as a toy, but as a tool they needed to trust. In this case, think of a driver who does a lot of highway mileage, drives smoothly, and actually respects the warm up and cool down of the engine. The RX spends most of its life doing what it loves: steady, gentle cruising at operating temperature, less stop and go abuse, fewer hard launches, very little racing from traffic light to traffic light, and then there's the big difference: Maintenance. Oil changes done on time, not when it's convenient, but when it's necessary. Correct oil grade, proper filters. Transmission fluid that actually gets changed, not ignored for 15 years. When something starts to wear, a wheel bearing, a bushing, a shock absorber, it's replaced, not left for later. This is the mindset that turns a normal car into a high mileage legend. A lot of drivers say Lexus is super reliable, but the real truth is more like this. Lexus rewards people who treat their cars decently. And when those two things meet, good engineering and responsible ownership, you get a 2009 RX that can cross 400,000 kilometers and still feel surprisingly close to new. How the RX feels behind the wheel at 420,000 kilometers. So, what does it actually feel like to drive a 2009 Lexus RX with 420,000 kilometers? You might expect the steering to be loose, the suspension to crash over bumps, and the cabin to rattle on every imperfect road. Instead, when this RX rolls down the street, it still has that typical Lexus character. The steering isn't razor sharp, but it's comfortable and predictable. It centers nicely, it doesn't wander, and it doesn't feel nervous at highway speeds. The suspension still absorbs most bumps with a soft, controlled motion. Yes, if you listen carefully, you might hear a few more knocks or small vibrations from worn-in components, but it's nothing like the harsh, clunky ride you often get in other 15-year-old SUVs. Most impressive of all is the noise level. At this age and mileage, many vehicles develop wind whistles, door seal gaps, and a constant soundtrack of rattling plastics. In this RX, the cabin is still relatively quiet. You get some road noise, some tire noise, but the overall feeling is still calm. The engine, even after 420,000 kilometers, doesn't sound like it's on its last breath. It idles smoothly. Under gentle acceleration, it's still refined. There may be a bit more vibration at high revs than when it was showroom fresh, but in normal driving, it's surprisingly civilized, and that's the key idea. It doesn't feel new, but it feels far better than the numbers suggest. This is the difference between a car that was designed to survive and one that was built only to impress for a few years. The interior. Aging, gracefully not falling apart. Inside the cabin, time always tells the truth. On a typical 15-year-old SUV, you see peeling plastics, broken buttons, sagging headliners, and cracked leather. In this 2009 Lexus RX, the interior has aged, yes, but it has aged gracefully. The driver's seat might show some creasing, maybe a bit of wear on the side bolster from years of getting in and out. The steering wheel may have lost some of its original texture, and the buttons on the most used areas might look a little shiny. But overall, the cabin still feels solid. The doors shut with weight. The dashboard doesn't creak and flex every time you go over a bump. The controls still click and move with that slightly over-engineered feeling Lexus was known for. Even small things, like the way the glove box closes or the way the center console lid feels in your hand, still have a sense of quality. This is extremely important for how new a car feels, because most of the time you don't see the odometer. You feel the car through the steering wheel, the seat, the sounds, and the way the cabin behaves. If the interior still feels tight, if the materials are not falling apart, your brain naturally says, "This car has more life left." That psychological effect is a big part of why this 2009 RX can be 15 years old with 420,000 kilometers and still trick you into feeling like you're driving something with half the mileage. The mechanic's perspective, why it still works. If you ask a mechanic what they think of a 420,000 kilometer vehicle, most of them will roll their eyes and say, "It's a miracle it's still moving." But when that vehicle is a 2009 Lexus RX, the reaction is often different. They might say things like the suspension components are worn, but the structure is still solid. The engine has some seepage, but it's not burning oil like crazy. The transmission is original, and it still shifts properly. What they often notice is this. The engine design is not overstressed. The cooling system is robust. The automatic transmission is well matched to the engine. The electronics are relatively simple and well protected. Of course, at this mileage, certain parts will have been replaced. Shocks and struts, control arm bushings, wheel bearings, maybe a radiator or water pump. But that's normal wear, not catastrophic failure. From a mechanic's point of view, the difference between a car they respect and a car they fear is whether the problems are predictable and fixable or random and destructive. The 2009 Lexus RX belongs to the first group. If you maintain it, it usually repays you with long, steady service. And that's why mechanics can look at a 420,000 kilometer RX and say something you don't hear often. If this one has been cared for, it could easily go even further. Should you buy a high mileage RX like this? So now comes the real question. Should you consider buying a high mileage 2009 Lexus RX? The answer is maybe yes, but only if you're smart about it. Here's what really matters more than the number on the odometer. 1. Maintenance history. Look for service records, regular oil changes, coolant changes, transmission fluid changes, evidence that the previous owner actually cared. 2. How it drives. Today, does the engine start easily, cold and hot? Are there any strange noises from the transmission? Does it shift smoothly without slipping or banging into gear? On the highway, does it track straight without constant correction? 3. Structural condition. Check for rust underneath. Frame rails, suspension mounting points, fuel and brake lines. Look closely at the wheel arches and door sills. A clean structure can outlive a tired engine. A rusty structure can kill even a perfect powertrain. 4. Interior wear versus mileage. If the odometer says 420,000 but the interior looks like 700,000, something doesn't add up. A reasonably clean cabin suggests the car was driven but not abused. 5. Your expectations. If you expect it to feel brand new, you'll be disappointed. If you expect a solid, comfortable, honest SUV that can still do years of daily work, you might be pleasantly surprised. The beauty of a 2009 Lexus RX is that even at 15 years old and 420,000 kilometers, it can still deliver exactly what you need: a quiet, reliable, stress-free way to get from A to B. And if you pick the right one, maintain it and drive it with a bit of respect. This old Lexus might be the most sensible, most cost-effective, and most surprisingly fresh-feeling car you've ever owned. So next time you see an older Lexus RX with a big number on the odometer, don't just walk away. Ask the right questions, take the right test drive, and you might discover that age and mileage don't always tell the whole story. Sometimes a 15-year-old SUV with 420,000 kilometers can still feel almost new.